It was 1942. The Pacific Ocean was burning. The early days of the Second World War had shown America a brutal reality. The skies belonged to Japan. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 dominated the Pacific theater, tearing through Allied air squadrons with unmatched agility and range. American pilots, brave as they were, often went up knowing they were flying into impossible odds. But something was about to change. Something that would rewrite aerial warfare forever. When Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation got the call from the U.S. Navy, the message was clear: America needed a new fighter. Fast, powerful, and deadly enough to take back control of the sky. The answer would come in the form of an aircraft that was not flashy, not exotic, but brutally effective. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was a beast that didn't whisper elegance. It roared efficiency. Nicknamed the Ace Maker, it became the instrument of air superiority that Japan never saw coming. Designed by Grumman's legendary engineer Leroy Grumman himself, the Hellcat was built with one simple goal: to outperform, outclimb, and outfight the Zero, and to bring American pilots home alive. The story of the Hellcat isn't just about technology or tactics. It's a story of learning from defeat, of a nation adapting faster than its enemy, and of men who risked everything inside an engine of war that would turn the tide of history. To understand why the F6F Hellcat became the best U.S. naval fighter of World War II, we need to go back to the beginning, to the lessons carved in smoke and fire after Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese struck in December 1941, America's air power in the Pacific was fragile. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, though sturdy, was struggling to keep up with the nimble Zeros. Pilots were being outturned, outgunned, and outnumbered. But what the Wildcat did have was toughness. Many pilots survived hits that would have shredded lighter aircraft. The engineers at Grumman knew that durability would be key. But they also knew toughness wasn't enough. The next generation had to have everything: strength, speed, and lethality. In early 1942, Grumman began work on an all-new fighter designated the F6F. But they didn't have the luxury of time. The war was raging and American carriers were desperate for an advantage. Engineers and test pilots worked around the clock, running tests, making modifications, and pushing deadlines. The first prototype took to the skies in June 1942, just months after design began. But something wasn't right. The initial version used a Wright R2600 engine, and though powerful, it couldn't deliver the punch the Navy needed. The Hellcat needed more. Enter the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. It was the same power plant that drove the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the most formidable fighters of the war. With that upgrade, the Hellcat transformed. Its speed jumped to over 380 miles per hour, its climb rate soared, and its high-altitude performance reached new heights. Grumman's engineers had found the perfect balance: power, durability, and simplicity. But specs alone don't make a legend. What truly made the Hellcat extraordinary was how it connected with its pilots. Many who flew it said it felt like an extension of their body. Forgiving, predictable, and strong, it could take incredible damage and still bring its pilot home, earning the affectionate nickname, Grumman Iron Works. This ruggedness wasn't just an engineering choice. It was a philosophy. Grumman built the Hellcat for war, not for air shows. As the Hellcat prepared to enter service, the U.S. Navy was rebuilding its carrier fleets. The USS Essex, USS Yorktown, and others would soon launch aircraft that could finally challenge Japanese supremacy. The timing was perfect. The Hellcat's debut coincided with a new phase in the Pacific War, one where American industry and training were catching up with Japan's early lead. The first operational squadron to receive the Hellcat was VF-9 aboard the USS Essex in early 1943. Pilots trained intensively, learning to master their new machine. They were skeptical at first. New aircraft always came with risks. But within weeks, confidence grew. The Hellcat climbed faster, dived steeper, and hit harder than anything they'd flown before. The Navy now had a fighter that could not only match the Zero but destroy it. When the Hellcat finally met the Zero in combat, the results were stunning. In the skies over the Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marianas, the Hellcat dominated. In one engagement after another, Japanese pilots found themselves outmatched. The Zero was still agile, but its light frame couldn't compete with the Hellcat's firepower and speed. And when it came to surviving hits, there was no comparison. A Zero could burn with a single tracer round. The Hellcat could take multiple cannon hits and keep flying. By late 1943, U.S. carrier groups were advancing relentlessly across the Pacific, and the Hellcat was at the spearhead. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns shredded enemy planes, and its pilots, many fresh from training, found themselves turning into aces almost overnight. The statistics would soon speak for themselves. By the end of the war, Hellcat pilots had destroyed 563 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied naval fighter. Its kill ratio an astonishing 19-1. 19 enemy planes down for every Hellcat lost. That kind of dominance didn't happen by chance. It came from a perfect marriage of design, training, and strategy. American pilots learned to fight the Zero not in its own arena, but on their own terms, using the Hellcat's superior dive, roll rate, and firepower. Instead of turning dogfights, they fought energy battles, striking from above, firing, and climbing away. The Hellcat made this possible. It turned aerial combat into science and survival into an expectation. By mid-1944, the Hellcat had become the backbone of naval aviation. The U.S. Navy now ruled the skies. And as the tide turned, so too did the war itself. By 1944, the F6F Hellcat had become more than just a fighter plane. It was the very embodiment of American dominance in the Pacific. Every major naval offensive from that point forward relied on Hellcats to control the skies. They were no longer just defending carriers, they were leading the charge. Wherever American fleets went, the Hellcats went first, clearing the path for bombers, protecting ships, and hunting Japanese aircraft mercilessly. The defining moment came in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a massive confrontation that would seal the Hellcat's place in history. The battle is now remembered by a name that perfectly captures its outcome, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The nickname wasn't born out of arrogance but from sheer disbelief at how one-sided the fight became. On that day, Japanese forces launched over 400 aircraft to attack the American fleet. Waiting for them in the skies were squadrons of Hellcats, piloted by young, determined American aviators. The result? A slaughter. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese planes had been shot down. American losses? Barely 30. Pilots joked afterward that it had been like shooting turkeys, hence the name that would go down in military lore. But beneath the jokes was a deeper truth. Japan's air power had been broken. The Hellcat, more than any other single machine, made that possible. The Japanese Zero, once the terror of the skies, had finally met its match. The Hellcat's rugged airframe could withstand hits that shattered the lightly built Zeros. Its high-speed dives and climbs gave pilots total control over engagements. The double Wasp engine delivered unmatched performance and reliability, and its 650 caliber machine guns made it a flying buzzsaw in combat. The Hellcat wasn't just superior, it was mercilessly efficient. What also made the F6F so effective was how forgiving it was to fly. Many American pilots entering the war had minimal experience. The Hellcat's stable handling and wide landing gear made it ideal for carrier operations, a notoriously difficult environment. It could take hard landings, heavy deck movements, even pilot errors, and still fly again. For new aviators that meant survival, and survival meant experience. Experience in turn meant dominance. One pilot famously said, "If you could fly a Hellcat, you could fight a war." And that's exactly what they did. The Hellcat's cockpit was designed with the pilot's perspective in mind. Large, clear instrumentation and wide visibility allowed better situational awareness. In dogfights, that mattered. Being able to spot an enemy first often meant living to see another day. Grumman's engineers thought of everything, from armor plating to self-sealing fuel tanks, to foldable wings that allowed more planes to fit on a carrier deck. Every inch of the aircraft screamed practicality and purpose. Its combat radius of nearly 1,000 miles made it perfect for Pacific operations, where islands were spread far apart. It could escort bombers, patrol wide ocean areas, and return home with enough fuel to land safely. Its design reflected the logistical demands of naval warfare, something Japan struggled to match as the war dragged on. By late 1944, the Hellcat was flying in almost every major Pacific engagement. Philippines, Ujima, Okinawa. Each new campaign brought fresh waves of Hellcats, and with them, a sense of inevitability. The skies belonged to the Americans now. Even when Japanese pilots introduced new aircraft like the Kwanishi N1 Ki-J Shiden or the Nakajima Ki-84, the Hellcat remained competitive. It was proof that while the Japanese had relied on perfection through agility, the Americans had achieved dominance through balance, a perfect combination of firepower, armor, speed, and endurance. But the Hellcat's impact wasn't just in numbers. It was psychological. The Japanese Navy, once confident and daring, began to crumble. Their veteran pilots were gone, replaced by inexperienced trainees thrown into hopeless battles. Meanwhile, American pilots grew more skilled, their tactics refined, their confidence unshakable. When they saw a Hellcat overhead, Japanese pilots knew what it meant. They were outmatched. The aces of the Pacific were made in Hellcats. Men like David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, who scored 34 aerial victories, all in a Hellcat. In one single day during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, McCampbell shot down 9 enemy aircraft in just over 90 minutes. His skill was extraordinary, but the Hellcat made such feats possible. It was a machine that amplified human courage. The Hellcat's adaptability also made it suitable for multiple roles. It wasn't just a dogfighter, it was a fighter-bomber, a night fighter, and even a reconnaissance aircraft. The F6F variant came equipped with radar, allowing it to hunt Japanese aircraft in the darkness, something few fighters of that era could do. Others carried bombs and rockets, providing devastating ground support. The same plane that had ruled the air could now destroy targets on land and sea with equal precision. In essence, the Hellcat wasn't just a fighter, it was a platform, a foundation upon which the Navy could build an entire strategy of offensive air warfare. And yet, for all its might, the Hellcat had a humble personality. Pilots often described it as honest. It didn't surprise you, didn't betray you, didn't demand perfection. It simply did what you asked, every single time. In an era where so many aircraft were fragile and temperamental, the Hellcat was like a dependable old friend, one that could kill when it needed to. Behind the Hellcat's success stood an unsung hero, Grumman's engineering philosophy. The company's nickname among pilots was the Iron Works, because their planes could take punishment and still get home. Stories spread across the fleet of Hellcats limping back to carriers with entire sections shot away, bullet holes everywhere, engines sputtering, yet still flying. That kind of reliability wasn't luck, and it saved lives, thousands of them. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. From 1943 to 1945, more than 12,000 Hellcats were produced. They accounted for 75% of all aerial victories by the U.S. Navy during the war. The kill ratio, 19-1, remains one of the highest in aviation history. No other fighter in the Pacific achieved that level of dominance. But beyond statistics and machinery, the Hellcat symbolized something deeper. It represented America's ability to adapt under pressure, to learn from early defeats and come back stronger. It was born not from victory, but from necessity. It wasn't the product of luck. It was the outcome of hard lessons, relentless innovation, and the sheer will to win. And when the war finally reached its most brutal stages, the long grind toward Japan itself, the Hellcat continued to lead. Even as the new F4U Corsair began joining frontline units, the Hellcat remained the Navy's workhorse. Together they painted the skies blue and silver, symbols of freedom, firepower, and the unstoppable momentum of Allied victory. As 1945 approached, Japan's Air Force was a shadow of what it once had been. But the war wasn't over. Kamikaze attacks were beginning and new dangers emerged. The Hellcat would face its final test, not in dogfights, but in survival against suicidal enemies who no longer cared about living. And once again, the Hellcat would prove why it was the best naval fighter America ever built. By early 1945, the Pacific War had turned into a relentless march toward Japan itself. The U.S. Navy was no longer fighting for survival, it was fighting for total victory. The F6F Hellcat, now battle-proven and trusted by every pilot who flew it, remained at the heart of that advance. From the skies over Iwo Jima to the deadly approaches of Okinawa, the Hellcat carved a legacy not only through victories but through endurance, both mechanical and human. At Iwo Jima, the Hellcat's role extended far beyond dogfights. It flew ground attack missions, strafing enemy positions, suppressing anti-aircraft fire, and providing close air support for the Marines trapped in brutal combat below. The volcanic island was a fortress of rock and fire, and air superiority was the only thing keeping U.S. forces alive. Hellcats dropped bombs, rockets, and napalm with precision, clearing paths for advancing troops. In those weeks of hell, the aircraft's name felt prophetic. It wasn't just a machine, it was fury with wings. But the most grueling test came soon after, in Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific campaign. By now Japan's conventional air power was broken. What remained was desperation, the kamikaze. These suicide attacks were terrifying, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. Entire carrier groups faced waves of explosive, laden planes diving straight into their decks. The Hellcat was thrust into a new, chilling role: interception at all costs. Hellcat pilots scrambled day and night, sometimes dozens of times per day, to intercept kamikaze formations before they could reach the fleet. Radar stations would pick up incoming blips, and within minutes, squadrons of F6Fs roared off carrier decks, engines screaming, racing against time. The pilots often had seconds to act. They knew that if they missed, hundreds of sailors could die. In these moments, courage and reflex mattered more than anything else. Many pilots later recalled the strange silence that followed a successful interception. The relief, the guilt, the exhaustion. They had saved their ship, but the image of burning aircraft and the realization that someone had chosen to die like that stayed with them forever. War was victory and tragedy woven together, And the Hellcat sat at the center of that paradox. Through it all, the Hellcat continued to show the traits that made it legendary: resilience, reliability, and raw strength. Pilots trusted it completely. Its armor plating absorbed shrapnel. Its self-sealing fuel tanks stopped fires before they spread. Even when returning to the carrier riddled with bullet holes, a Hellcat could land safely. Its hydraulic landing gear and rugged tailhook enduring punishment other aircraft couldn't survive. Carrier crews came to love the F6F for another reason. It was easy to maintain. In the sweltering heat of the Pacific, with salt corroding metal and supplies stretched thin, simplicity mattered. Mechanics could replace parts quickly, engines were accessible, and Grumman's modular design philosophy meant even major damage could be repaired at sea. While Japan struggled with shortages and increasingly fragile machines, America's Iron Works fighter kept flying day after day. Behind the frontline triumphs was a story of extraordinary industrial power. The United States built over 12,000 Hellcats in just over 2 years, an almost impossible feat of wartime production. Grumman's factories in Bethpage, New York ran 24 hours a day. Thousands of workers, men and women, labored side by side assembling fuselages, testing engines, and shipping the fighters straight to waiting carriers. The Hellcat wasn't only a machine of war, it was the physical expression of an entire nation's will to fight. For many young pilots, the Hellcat became their home. They painted nose art, gave their planes names: Paper Doll, Little Joe, Mincy Thur. These weren't just aircraft, they were companions. Each mission forged a bond between man and machine, a relationship built on mutual survival. When the engine roared to life before a dawn launch, every pilot knew he was trusting his life to the skill of those who had built it, and to the design that had already carried so many safely through fire. By the time U.S. forces reached Okinawa, the end of the war was visible but still far away. The skies were full of smoke and chaos. Kamikaze waves intensified, and even the mightiest ships suffered losses. But the Hellcats were always there, on patrol, on escort, on guard. In total, they destroyed nearly 1,500 kamikaze aircraft before they could strike. It's impossible to calculate how many lives that saved, but veterans would later say it was countless. Then came the final months, the raids over Japan itself. American carrier task forces now operated within striking distance of the homeland. Hellcats escorted bombers over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, battling the remnants of Japanese resistance. The once mighty Zero was now obsolete. Against the Hellcat's armor and speed, it stood no chance. For the first time in the war, Japanese airmen fought defensively over their own soil and lost. But even as victory approached, there was a bittersweet air among Hellcat pilots. They knew that their era was ending. Jet aircraft were on the horizon. The Hellcat, with its roaring radial engine and propeller blades, represented the peak of piston-driven warfare. Soon, newer fighters like the F6F Bearcat and the jet-powered F9F Panther would take its place. Yet no one doubted the legacy it would leave behind. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Hellcats were still flying patrols over the Pacific, watching for last-minute attacks that never came. On carrier decks across the fleet, sailors and pilots gathered to listen to the news. Many of them were sitting inside their Hellcats when they heard the words that would end years of bloodshed. And so was the Hellcat's reign. But what a reign it had been. From its first combat flight in 1943 to its last mission in 1945, it had utterly transformed naval aviation. It gave the United States a fighter that not only matched its enemy but crushed it. It was the hammer that broke the Japanese air arm. It gave birth to hundreds of aces, saved thousands of lives, and changed the course of the Pacific War. Historians often debate what made the F6F truly the best. Was it the kill ratio? The production numbers? The versatility? The answer lies somewhere deeper. The Hellcat was the best because it was perfectly balanced for its time and purpose. It didn't need to be the fastest or the prettiest. It just needed to win, and to bring its pilot home. And that, more than anything, is what it did. In the post-war years, the Hellcat continued to serve with distinction. It was used by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps for training, by reserve units, and by foreign allies. It even flew into the early jet age, a relic of propeller power that refused to be forgotten. At air shows decades later, its deep radial growl still sends shivers down the spines of those who know its story. Every rivet, every bullet hole patched on its fuselage, every faded emblem on its wing carries the memory of a generation who fought not for conquest but for freedom. And at the heart of that fight stood one machine, forged in steel and sweat, designed for victory but remembered for its soul, the F6F Hellcat. It didn't begin the war, but it ended it from above. When peace finally settled over the Pacific, the Hellcat rested at last. It had fought in more battles, won more dogfights, and saved more lives than any other naval fighter of World War II. But its story didn't end with the signing of the surrender. In many ways, that moment was just the beginning of its legend. For pilots, the Hellcat wasn't just a weapon, it was a teacher. It taught courage, discipline, and survival. It demanded respect, and it gave back loyalty. Those who had flown it often said that no aircraft ever felt so alive, so aware, so ready to protect the man inside it. When veterans looked back decades later, their voices softened when they spoke its name. There was something almost sacred about the bond between pilot and Hellcat, forged in the roar of engines and the flash of tracer fire over endless blue seas. In the years after the war, as the world transitioned into the Cold War and the jet age dawned, the Hellcat's role faded into history, yet it remained a benchmark, a symbol of what happens when engineering genius meets human bravery. It was the perfect machine for its moment in time. Nothing wasted, nothing overcomplicated. It did its job, and it did it better than anything else. Even today, historians and aviation enthusiasts marvel at its record. More than 75% of all aerial victories by the U.S. Navy in the Pacific were achieved by Hellcats. Its kill ratio of 19-1 has never been matched by any other carrier-based fighter in history. But beyond statistics, it was the spirit of the plane that defined it, its resilience, its reliability, its sheer will to survive. When one walks beside a surviving Hellcat in a museum hangar today, the silence feels heavy. Its dark blue skin reflects the lights above, and for a moment, you can almost hear the echo of the Pacific winds, the rush of takeoff from a pitching carrier deck, the staccato of 50 calibers firing into the sky. It's a ghost of history that still breathes, still reminds us of what it meant to fight and endure. The F6F Hellcat wasn't the most glamorous aircraft. It wasn't the fastest or the most elegant. But in every measure that truly mattered, in combat, in reliability, in human lives saved, it was the best. The best naval fighter of World War II, and one of the greatest combat aircraft ever built. As the final battles of the Pacific fade into memory, the Hellcat stands eternal, a steel guardian of history. A plane that turned fear into victory, defeat into dominance, and young men into heroes. The skies it once ruled are quiet now, but the legend remains. Because when the world needed a fighter that could win the war from the sea, and they called it the F6F Hellcat.